Hello there, my name is Yorkie and welcome to the channel for episode 9 of the in-depth track guide series for Assetto Corsa Competizione, a series where we go through each circuit, breaking it down corner by corner, giving you all the juicy knowledge, tips and information that you need to learn each track properly and improve your lap times. So if the series is of interest to you and you are new here, then please consider subscribing to the channel with the bell notification so you won't miss out on any future episodes. And if you want to support the channel further, you can find links to my social media pages down in the description below, as well as a link to my Discord server where it'll be awesome to have you come in and join the growing community. So for this 9th episode in the series, we are going to be looking at the Hungaroring in Hungary. The circuit is 2.72 miles in length, which equates to 4.38 kilometers, has a total of 14 corners, will require a high downforce setup with soft to medium suspension to handle the bumps. And then, as you can see listed, the key action areas for overtaking is going to be turn 1, turn 2, turn 6, turn 12, 13 and the final corner, turn 14. Do note that this circuit is rather difficult to overtake on, but if your opponents make a mistake and an opportunity presents itself, these are the corners where you're most likely to get a successful overtake. Just like the previous episodes, we'll take a look at the pit lane first, and the pit entry is accessible just before the final corner. You'll need to run down the inside of the barrier and on the inside of the turn here, so you'll need to slow down before you get into the pit entry. You can then accelerate a little bit before you come to the pit speed limiter line, which is just before the end of the red, white and green painted tarmac as seen here. When it comes to accelerating out of the pit exit, there is a marshal hut on the left hand side up against the pit wall just as you're coming towards the end of the pit lane barrier. At this point you can release the pit limiter, accelerate out of the pit lane and hang to the right hand side of that white line that runs down towards the first corner. So when it comes to turn 1 itself at racing speed, this is going to be our braking point here, roughly about 110-120 meters before we get to the corner. We're going to be braking from the left hand side of the circuit, shifting all the way down into first gear and then aiming to clip our apex point on the inside curve just here. There's very little camber in this corner, so that's not really going to help you. And in the wet conditions, you'll want to take caution with this inside curb, as there is some unpainted curbstone on the inside there that could become very slippery when wet. When coming out through the exit in the dry conditions, you want to run out nice and wide out here. Don't run out too wide, there is some astroturf and that could potentially cost you some traction. And as this is a key traction area coming off a slow corner, you'll want to avoid running out to this exit curb in the wet conditions, as running over that will just hurt you when trying to apply the power down into the tarmac. Next up is turn 2, and our braking point is at the start of the curbing there on the right hand side of the track. You will need to do some trail braking as you come into this turn, trying to help bleed that speed off, and then as you actually come through the corner itself, you want to hook up the car with an early apex and then continue to coast the car through the corner, hugging that inside curb all the way through. You don't necessarily need to be touching it, as it is an unpainted curbstone. It can be quite slippery, so definitely avoid it in the wet conditions. And then as you come out through the exit of the turn, you want to hang towards the middle of the circuit. Try and hang it as tight on the exit as you possibly can, because turn 3 pretty much immediately follows. What we're going to need to do is get the car back over to the left hand side of the track as early as possible to try and open up turn 3, as it is a more crucial corner. There's going to be no braking zone. You're going to carry the speed through the turn completely flat out, and ideally you want to stay off the inside curb, as it will bounce the car and it will bottom out, which will cost you a little bit of momentum going up the hill. Obviously avoid this in the wet conditions. And then when coming out through the exit, use that exit curb in the dry conditions, but do take caution in the wet. You can get away with it sometimes, but if you're carrying a little bit too much steering input, you can potentially unsettle the car and pitch it into a spin. Climbing up the hill, we're going to come into turn 4. This is going to be the start of our braking point, which is the beginning of the curb here on the right hand side of the circuit. We're going to drop the car down into third gear and fully commit to the turn, aiming to hit our apex on the inside curb just here. You can usually take a fair amount of curb, but the more curb that you do take off on the inside, the more likely you're going to bounce the car out wide coming out through the exit, so do take caution with that. Obviously take caution with the curb in the wet conditions as well. And And then when coming out to the exit curb itself, we want to try and maximize the curb usage out here, but you need to keep 2 wheels on the red and white serrated curbing just to avoid any track limits infringements. And in the wet conditions, you'll be wanting to avoid running out this wide and onto the curb pretty much entirely. We then very rapidly come into the braking zone for turn 5, where we need to try and get the car as far left as possible to open up the turn. Trail brake into the corner, shifting down into second gear. This is going to be the apex that we're aiming to hit relatively mid-corner-ish. You want to use a little bit of the curb on the inside in the dry conditions, avoid it in the wet conditions as the curbstone will become very slippery. We're going to hug that inside curb throughout the turn, and then as we come out to the exit, we should be full throttle by the time that the inside curb actually ends. We're going to make full use of the curbing on the outside here in the dry conditions. Obviously just don't venture out too far that you infringe track limits, and obviously in the wet conditions as well, as traction is key, you'll want to avoid running out onto this curb to avoid losing any grip. Next up is the chicane of turn 6 and 7. This is going to be the start of our braking point on the left hand side of the track here at the beginning of this rumble strip. We're going to be shifting the car down into first or second gear depending on the gear ratios and the preference of the car. And then as we actually come into the 2 apexes on turn 6 and 7 itself, the amount of curb that we can take here on the inside is going to be dependent on the car's handling characteristics and your car's setup. Some cars you can take these curbs very aggressively and ride quite a lot of them. Other cars you will want to be a lot more cautious with these curbs and not take so much, avoiding the orange turtle shell curb that is there on the inside. Once we carry that speed through, we're out onto the exit with the serrated curb out here and an unpainted curbstone. You'll want to use this in the dry to try and maximise the acceleration coming off of the corner, but obviously in the wet conditions, as this is a traction zone, you'll probably want to be avoiding this curb pretty much entirely. Very quickly after the chicane, we're into the braking zone for turn 8. There's no real reference in and around here, so this is the rough braking point that I use. You should be able to carry the car through the corner in second or third gear, climb up onto that inside curb in the dry conditions to try and minimise the track's distance. In the wet conditions, you'll want to be very cautious in riding this curb. And then as we come out through the exit, you're not going to run all the way out to the exit curb. You want to try and hang towards the middle of the circuit as we come out here, and then we want to try and bring the cars far left, ready to open up turn 9. This is going to be our rough braking point coming into this corner. We should be down in second gear for this right-hander. Focus on getting a good smooth run through the turn and getting that good drive coming off through the exit, using that inside curb in the dry conditions, avoid it in the wet conditions. And then when it comes to the exit itself, we got a serrated curb with some astroturf out here. Use that in the dry conditions, try and maximize the amount of curb usage without infringing track limits. Avoid it in the wet conditions as it will cost you grip and most likely cause you to pitch yourself into a spin. And then we're very quickly into turn 10. No braking zone for this corner. You want to brush the inside curb in the dry conditions, don't necessarily ride it. You definitely don't want to be riding it in the wet conditions. Try and keep the car as far left as you possibly can through the corner and out through its exit to try and open up turn 11 that follows. This is going to have a very short braking zone, just a quick stab of the brake and throwing the car in. You may need to shift down a single gear down into third as we go and run the inside curb in the dry conditions. You want to take extreme caution with this inside curb in the wet conditions as it's quite a medium to high speed corner. And then when we come off the turn and out into the exit, we want to try and maximize the speed coming off the corner, so we're going to use plenty of curb on the outside here whilst trying to keep 2 wheels on that red and white serrated curb to avoid exceeding track limits. Use this curb in the dry conditions, however you want to avoid it in those wet conditions to avoid losing any potential grip. And then we're into the final 3 quarters with the braking zone of turn 12. It's going to be just after the 100 meter board and just before the curbing on the left hand side begins. We're going to shift down into first or second gear depending on the car's gear ratios, and then go and mount the curb on the inside there in the dry conditions. Use plenty of that, although if you do catch the curb too aggressively, it may potentially bounce you out wide a little bit. In the wet conditions, you'll probably be fine to take the serrated curb, but you'll want to take extreme caution when touching that inside curbstone. Coming out through the exit of turn 12, similar story to a lot of the other slow speed corners around the track. You can use it fairly comfortably in the dry conditions, however you'll be wanting to avoid it in the wet conditions. And then we come into the braking zone for turn 13, the penultimate corner. We're going to be braking from the right hand side of the track, shifting down into first or second gear depending on the car's gear ratios. We can then hook up either two apexes, one early and one late, or we can hook up a mid-corner apex and just hug that inside curve throughout the duration of the turn. You don't necessarily need to run it in the dry conditions, and you certainly want to be avoiding it in the wet. When it comes to the exit of the corner, the track does open up for you here as the pit entry is there on the right hand side, so use this to your advantage. You can use some of the curbing out here as well in the dry conditions, however you will want to avoid it in the wet conditions as it will cost you the traction trying to apply the power. And then we come into the braking zone for the final corner. We're going to need to get the car back over to the left hand side to try and open up the turn. Use that marshal hut on the left hand side as your braking reference. Then coming into the apex, we want to hook up a very late apex and focus on the exit. We're going to gradually bring the car in towards that inside curve, which we don't need to touch in neither the dry or the wet conditions, as that's going to hurt the traction coming off the corner. And then as we come out through the exit, we're going to let the car run out wide. Use this exit curb that is out here to our advantage. You can use this in the dry conditions to maximize your run to the start finish line. However, in the wet conditions you'll want to avoid running out here as it will hurt your run and cost you time at the end of the lap. So that's the breakdown of all the corners. Let's jump in the car and do a flying lap to piece it all together. So having set a fairly solid lap here around the Hungaroring, I just want to finish the episode by saying that all the brake markers and apexes that you have seen here and the amount of curb use that you can use is going to depend on the car and conditions that you are obviously driving in. As I mentioned, you got the dry versus the wet conditions, and some curbs you can take in the wet, however other curbs you need to avoid or be cautious with. But obviously depending on the setup and also the actual car that you're driving, some cars handle curbs a little bit better, some are able to brake a little bit harder and later than other cars as well. So please keep that in mind as you're lapping around the circuit and taking everything on board here. If you enjoyed the episode though, please give the video a thumbs up. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to the channel as well. And as I mentioned, social media links and links to my Discord server are down in the description below. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again in the next one. But until then, have fun, stay safe, and take care.